Lieutenant? Curry sat in his jump seat and reviewed the background information provided by Command after assigning him this mission. Humanity's entrance to the rest of the intergalactic community wasn't without its turbulence. A few disastrous first contact experiences resulted in some kind of conflict or the other. First contact with the Amners resulted in a battle before the mistake was recognized and corrected. Having your translation program call the Amner captain a rotting ball of shit is not conducive to friendly talk. First contact with the Thrall nearly started a war when the friendly gesture of sharing a drink almost killed the Thrall ambassador. Neither side knew the Thrall were highly allergic to alcohol, but quick action by medical staff corrected that issue. And then there was a 5-year war with the Vrokruk after they mistook a smile for a threat display and responded in kind. And things went downhill from there with 4 Vrokruk and 7 humans dead. The war showed humanity could hold their own against a more advanced race, but that was the only real gain of the war. Tens of thousands died on both sides with minimal gain of territory. Neither side was fully committed to the war, and they willingly let the Marania arbitrate a fair peace treaty. One of the things humanity did learn in the war with the Vrokruk and several other skirmishes over the years was they were severely outnumbered by many species. With only 50 billion people, a large-scale war would strain their ability to increase their military and keep production up to support it. One area humanity excelled in was the field of robotics. Trading with some other species allowed them to rapidly improve those skills and produce powerful AI systems. Eventually, the AI advanced enough to achieve sentience. Concerns about them going rogue were solved by the simple act of treating them as members of human society and not just tools. They had as big a stake in the future of humanity as biological humans. This eventually led to the creation of advanced bots with the capability to operate independently or directly control an AI. At first, military and exploration were solely androids, but they eventually began experimenting with different forms. K9s, snakes, birds, and crocodiles to start, and are now experimenting with other forms. 3rd Platoon, Delta Company, 2nd Battalion, 1 SD Regiment of the 4th Terran Marines were en route to one of these labs they'd lost contact with 4 days ago. Lieutenant Khoury and his platoon were training in a nearby system and sent to investigate. It was on a small moon with a stable atmosphere that enabled it to sustain life. Several different types of environments made it perfect for testing new designs. The lead scientist was W. Bishop, and the controlling AI called itself AI, an AI that seemed to have a sense of humor. The compound was staffed with 67 humans and 25 advanced security androids. Lieutenant? Khoury was interrupted by the pilot's voice over the speaker. Arrival at Janos V. Iguria Base. Atmospheric entry in 45 seconds. The pilot broadcast. Lieutenant? Khoury tucked the datapad away, checked his harness, and checked his Marines. He would have been surprised if any of them weren't squared away. None of his Marines willingly upset his platoon sergeant, SFC Rook, and his fondness for roasting you. The shuttle entered the atmosphere and bounced around like a rookie in the squad washer. And then they were through and the shuttle leveled out. Lieutenant, can you come up here? The pilot said over the direct comm channel. Lieutenant. Khoury unbuckled and headed to the cockpit. With a nod of his head, letting Sergeant Rook know to join him. Take a look, sir, the pilot said while pointing out the front cockpit window. What the hell? The lieutenant exclaimed. The main building had sustained serious damage, and there were signs of weapons fire in the surrounding area. Circle the compound before setting down. The lieutenant exclaimed. They just saw more of the same, wrecked buildings, scorch marks, and burned foliage. They also saw what looked like bodies but were androids upon closer look. As the shuttle began its landing procedures, Lieutenant, Khoury turned to his platoon sergeant. I don't like it. Prep for hot L's landing, even if nothing shows. Sergeant! Rook nodded and replied, I was going to suggest the same thing, sir. With that, Sergeant. Rook returned to the back and gave the Marines their orders. Listen up. Hot L's deployment. I want the 1 squad on perimeter security. Turning to 1 Est squad Stjut, he said, Pull any extras needed from 2N Squad, Mike. Sergeant! Taylor and Sepal Lask of 2N Squad nodded in agreement. 2N and 3RD Squad, grab everything you can on the way out. We won't waste time coming back for more, and the pilot is taking off the moment we're off. The hot landing went off without a hitch. Long practice by training and field experience had the Marines handle it as if it was just another drill. The moment the shuttle touched down on the hard surface of the landing pad, 1ST Squad and 4 Marines from 2N Squad hit the ground and automatically took up positions 360 degrees around the shuttle. The rest of 2N Squad and 3RD Squad grabbed the extra ammo and med supplies. They also helped the heavy weapons element with their gear. Seeing everything was off, Lieutenant, Corey grabbed the last cubby of water and left the shuttle. The pilot took off moments after the lieutenant departed. He was ordered to remain overhead and be ready for immediate evac. The lieutenant yelled for Sergeant Rook, his squad leaders, and the Sepal in charge of the heavy weapons fire team join up with him for orders. All right, we're going to move off this pad and head for that building there. It's supposed to connect to the main structure via a tunnel. 1ST Squad security for the column. The rest of you grab everything and we'll sort equipment out once we are in cover. The lieutenant continued, I want us out of the open ASAP. Something about this feels very, very wrong. It was almost a relief when the other NCOs replied they had the same feeling. One of the things the years of combat had taught all of them was to listen to that feeling. What many people called a sixth sense was your body responding to various sensory inputs you didn't actively notice. Training helped hone the ability to refine those inputs either consciously or to acknowledge they existed at all. The platoon made it to the building without incident and began getting ready for combat. Packs dropped, water holders topped off, a couple of ration bars tucked away, medkits checked, and a double combat load of ammo and explosives. Several Marines, including the lieutenant and sergeant Rook, carried more ammo for the heavy weapons team. Investigating the tunnel found it collapsed, so the platoon had no option but to cross open ground to the main building. 3RD Squad, take point. 2 in rear guard, 1 est watch the flanks. The lieutenant ordered. He then moved to the front and asked Jackson if 3RD Squad was ready. At his nod, the lieutenant replied, Well, we didn't get dressed up for nothing, and opened the door. The 2 Marines on point moved out and scanned the area. Once they got the all-clear signal, Curry and Sepal, Jackson exited the door, followed by the rest of 3RD Squad. The only bad moment was what sounded like a roar that wasn't far enough away. The 2 on point entered the building and waved the rest of the squad inside. A large, wide corridor stretched out before them. Doors lined either side of the corridor, possibly offices. Debris was strewn all over the floor and the walls were heavily damaged and in some places streaked with blood. Using hand signals, Lieutenant Corey had each room checked for life. They did turn out to be offices and it wasn't pretty. Some were empty and intact, but several had busted out windows and walls. The debris pattern indicated whatever did it busted in and not out. A few offices contained what was left of the former occupants. They were gruesomely dead with blood and bits of flesh strewn everywhere. One team signaled they found something, and everyone else stopped where they were and took up defensive positions. The lieutenant and sergeant Rook made their way down the hall to see what they'd found. One of the advanced security androids was strewn about an office. The lieutenant hoped to find some sign of who the attackers were. Fragments or chemical residue from whatever blew the android into several pieces, but no signs were found upon examination. Sergeant Rook was examining another part of the android when he cursed under his breath. He crept over to the torso the lieutenant was checking out. Careful to keep his voice low, he whispered to the lieutenant, Sir, this wasn't blown up. It was torn apart by something. After taking a moment to look at the torso and other parts, he muttered, Shit, have the men bring the parts into the hallway. I don't like being exposed by the window. The lieutenant ordered. Yes, sir. I know exactly how you feel. The sergeant replied. The lieutenant and Scott carried the torso out and the team brought out the rest. They laid the android down and put his parts where they should have been. The lieutenant sent a man to fetch Kiel Ferris, the heavy weapons fire team leader. He was also their explosives expert. He continued to inspect the various body parts of the android until the soldier returned with Kiel Ferris. As soon as the Seeple joined the group, the lieutenant whispered to the Kupol, "Take a look at this android and see if you can tell me what explosive was used on it." The Seeple just nodded and began his inspection. After a cursory inspection, he looked at the lieutenant and said, "This wasn't explosives. It looks like it was ripped apart. What the hell could do that to one of these? That chassis is combat rated. Then what the hell could do that?" The lieutenant exclaimed. "Seeple." Ferris examined several small holes along the rent edges of the torso. "Hey, Lieutenant, look at these." As he pointed at the holes. "What ya got, Corporal?" The lieutenant responded. "See, pal." Ferris put a finger in each of the holes. "I think these are from whatever tore this apart." And notice the pattern? Now that the Seeple pointed it out, he saw a U-shaped pattern. "Is that what I think it is?" the lieutenant asked. The Seeple nodded and pointed at similar marks on the other half of the torso. "I think those are teeth marks, and following that pattern, it looks like there were 4 different creatures that did this." A voice from the doorway provided the answer. It was done by the raptors. A very disheveled man in a blood-splattered lab coat said. He was very nervous and looked like he would jump out of his skin if someone spooked him. "I found him hiding in one of the storage rooms," one of his Marines informed him. "Get the medic." The LT ordered the Marine. With a quick nod of his head, the Marine left the office and ran down the hall. The lieutenant then looked back to the man and introduced himself. "Lieutenant Corey, 4th Terran Marines." "And who am I addressing?" The anxious man looked around before speaking. "Dr. Monroe. I'm one of the researchers here." With his usual disdain for civility toward civilians, Stat Rook spoke up. "Raptors? Do you mean like birds?" "No, more like the dinosaur kind," Dr. Monroe replied. "But weren't velociraptors kind of small?" "Seeple," Ferris asked. "What?" "My kid loves dinosaurs, and I guess some of what he told me stuck." "Seeple," Ferris replied at Lieutenant Curie's amused look. Dr. Monroe replied, "Yes, the real ones were about half as tall as a human." "Lieutenant," Corey asked, "how could something that small do this much damage?" "Notice I said real ones. The ones we built are much bigger," Dr. Monroe answered. "You didn't." "Seeple," Ferris exclaimed. "Sergeant." Rook gave couple Ferris a withering glance. "Do not interrupt the lieutenant." "Again, Corporal. Am I understood?" Looking abashed, Seeple, Ferris replied. "Yes, Sergeant. I apologize, Lieutenant." With a nod of his head, Lieutenant Corey looked at Seeple. "Ferris, what did they do?" "Did you see that movie that came out around 10 years ago? The one where they cloned the Karzanek's extinct predator species and tried to put them in a zoo but they escaped?" the Seeple asked. The LT and the Sky both nodded their heads. It was a remake of an old Terran movie from the 20th century. It's been remade several times over the years. The last was about 60 years ago. I watched it with my kid. They cloned dinosaurs, including velociraptors that were bigger than a person. They were also smart and very dangerous. I think the ones these idiots built are like those. Seeple, Ferris finished. The lieutenant looked at the doctor, who just nodded his head. "Well, so what are we looking at, Doc? How big are they and what were they created for? And all the other crap we should know to stay alive," the lieutenant demanded, gesturing to the blood on the walls to emphasize that last part. The doctor stared at the blood splatters like he'd never seen them before. "They are about 2 meters tall, 3 meters long from snout to tail. Weighs around 300 kg for the standard type and 500 kg for the armored version with 20 m alloyed armor. bipedal with medium-length arms and full articulation of the arms. It can use its hands in much the same way as a security android. Its feet have large talons to help on unstable terrain, but can also be used as a weapon. Its muzzle is 70 km long, contains 42 serrated teeth, and a bite force of over 8,000 psi. Lieutenant? Curry took a moment to process this before asking, what are they designed for? Scouting, tracking, and silent elimination of enemy scouts or sentries, for the standard type in combat, both straight-up and ambush tactics, for the armored ones. The doctor answered. How fast are they? Sergeant, Rook asked. The standard top out at 100 kf on flat ground, and the armored are slightly slower at 65 kp. Was the reply. Crap. Anything else we should know? Sergeant, Rook sarcastically asked. The doctor hesitated before answering. The armored ones hunt in packs. Are you shitting me? The sergeant roared. And they don't have their souls implanted yet. The doctor finished. Souls? The LT inquired. It's our nickname for the programming that connects them to any of the AI to receive updates, orders, or even allow an AI to take direct control. It also regulates things like friend or foe identification and rules of engagement, such as no attacking non-combatants. He finished. Oh, FFS. Sergeant, Rook exclaimed. Lieutenant? Corey waved him to silence. Are there any other survivors? There might be a few hiding like me, but most would have made for the main core of the AI. It was designed to survive a nuclear strike, so the rogue droids shouldn't be able to break in. Dr. Monroe answered. Lieutenant? Corey thought for a moment before speaking. We'll head to the main core. They might be able to pinpoint people in hiding instead of wandering around and running into those raptors. Or are there more than those wandering around? I don't know. The doctor replied, I only saw them, so not sure what else is out of control, but the AI can tell you. The lieutenant looked around and then said, Well, stat! Sounds like we'll need more than 50 men and more heavy weapons if we are to do anything more than evac. And that might be iffy. Summon the squad leaders. Lieutenant? Corey briefed his squad leaders on the new information to pass down to their men. And that's our situation. Our options are limited, so we head for that bunker. Lieutenant? Corey brought up a map of the facility with a route marked by Dr. Monroe. We can move from building to building via corridors and will search as we go. But the problem is going to be between this building and this one. Lieutenant? Curie said while pointing at the map. That's the main way in, but we'll have to cover this open space. How much are we talking about? Sergeant? Taylor asked. Too damn much. 150 meters. The lieutenant had to wait out the groans and curses before he could continue. Yeah, I know. But all other options are worse. So we do our jobs and embrace the suck. The lieutenant continued, I want noise discipline so everything's strapped down. The crates and cubies stay on this side of the clearing, so load up on as much ammo and med supplies as possible. Also, fill up the canteens and get a drink. Since 3RD had point last time, I want 1 est on point 2 end at the rear and 3RD middle. The lieutenant continued, 1 est will hold the door until the other units are inside. I'll lead point and sergeant. Rook will join the 2ND. Before sergeant Rook and other squad leaders could complain, the lieutenant added, I'm not asking them to take that risk without leading them. See, pal. Ferris, I want your teams in the middle with 3RD. It'll make it easier for you to support either 1 est and 2 N squad. Any other questions? No? Good. Let's get it done. It took another hour for the platoon to sweep and clear each building along their route. When they'd finally reached the door that led to the open space, they stopped and loaded up with more ammo, med supplies, and ration bars. The lieutenant was joined by Sergeant Rook as they peered out the door and scanned the clearing and tree line for any sign of the rogue droids. Anything? Lieutenant? Corey asked his sergeant. I don't spot anything, but I got a bad feeling about this, he responded. Yeah, me too, but we can't just sit here spanking the monkey all day, and I'll feel a lot better with several meters of steel and dirt between us and them. The lieutenant replied. I'll take one stover and set up that perimeter around the door. Send 3 RD when we are set, and follow with 2N at your discretion. He ordered. I'm sending Collins, the doctor, and the corpseman with the 3 RD squad. Yes, sir, don't get eaten. I don't want to be in charge. The sergeant replied with a grin. Thanks for the vote of confidence. The lieutenant returned with a wry smile before ordering 1 squad on me. The lieutenant looked at his Marines, quick and silent. Half circle around that door. Head on a swivel, watch your flank and watch out for each other. I'll go first. Potts and Henderson right on my ass. 3-man teams every 2 seconds and the last team will have 4. The lieutenant ordered before he exited the door, and the 3 of them crossed the open ground at a quick but not hurried pace. Getting into too much of a hurry is how fatal mistakes are made. Upon reaching the door safely, he checked the progress of the rest of the 1 squad and placed his men in a half circle around the door. 3 RD squad was crossing as a group when it happened. A bipedal metal nightmare broke cover and charged at them. Contact, someone yelled, and all hell broke loose. Someone screamed, "Oh, shit!" Raptor! The sound of weapons fire was deafening as bullets pinged off the metallic monstrosity. Focus fire! The lieutenant ordered, his voice in a clear command reining in the troops' urge to panic. As multiple rifles fired at the single target, the explosive rounds began to do some damage. The Raptor got into the middle of 3 RD squad and chaos reigned. Men were stomped on, bitten, and tossed around. Dr. Monroe was grabbed around the waist, his torso separating from his lower half with the violent shaking. A well-thrown grenade entered the beast's maw and nearly blew its jaw off. It turned and ran for the jungle, trailing smoke from its mangled face. The lieutenant looked around and was appalled by just how much damage was done in less than 5 minutes. 7 dead, 2 will join them without a high level of medical care, and most of 3 RD squad had various types of injuries from broken bones to torn flesh. Sergeant! Rook's voice roared over the chatter and screams of the wounded. Get your shit together, you're Terran fucking Marines. Now act like it. After a brief moment of relief to find the sergeant alive, the lieutenant ordered, grab our wounded and dead, and get your ass inside. The clear orders given by the lieutenant and sergeant brought order out of the chaos, and the last Marine passed through the door in less than 3 minutes. While others took a moment to catch their breath, the corpsemen and some helpers did what they could for the wounded. The fallen were placed in body bags after the lieutenant collected their tags. Sergeant, send out a couple of scouts to figure out where we go next. The lieutenant ordered. Aye, sir, was the reply before Sergeant Rook went to the front of the group to send scouts forth. Check your ammo, get some water, and then get ready to move. The LT ordered, checking his datapad for a map of the building. While waiting for the scouts to report back, the time was spent bandaging up the wounded and redistributing gear to those hale enough to carry it. It was almost 20 minutes before the scouts returned with the route through the maze of corridors and access tunnels. It was slow going, with wounded and others carrying the sorrowful load of their fallen brothers and sisters. They never even considered leaving their dead behind. Centuries of tradition made the motto Nemo Residio, Latin for leave no one behind, second nature to the Marines. They'd only break that in the direst of circumstances. With frequent rest breaks to rest the wounded and rotate those carrying the body bags, meant it took them almost 45 minutes to reach the blast door of the main core and its dubious safety. The door refused to open when they tried the terminal, next to it on the wall. The lieutenant pushed the call button and spoke into the mic. Open this damn door before I blow it down. Too pissed to consider he didn't have near enough explosives to even dent the door. Without warning, the door began to silently lift up and reveal a circular door that then opened into a large chamber. Inside were maybe 30 humans and a handful of security androids. An older human and a holographic image of an androgynous human walked towards them. Thank God you're here. We weren't sure our message got through, the human exclaimed. I'm Dr. Bishop, and this is Anai, our AI in charge of running the complex. Welcome, Lieutenant. Mikasa! Sukasa! The AI greeted them in a melodious voice. Elt Kuri, 4 Terran Marines, he stated before introducing Sergeant Rook and his squad leaders. We never got your message. We were sent because they hadn't gotten any messages from you for several days. Lieutenant Kuri started, but first, do you have any medical facilities or supplies here? I have some badly wounded Marines that need care. Indicating them with his arm, Dr. Bishop waved over to one group of scientists. Dr. Burns, Dr. Xavier, and Dr. Walsh have medical degrees and can try to care for your wounded. The 3 doctors stood up and hurried over. Anai also ordered several of the security droids to retrieve medical supplies, tables, and other equipment for them. Anai spoke up. I'm afraid my facilities are limited, but we'll do all we can. And with that, another hologram appeared, in medical scrubs, no less, and directed the Marines to bring the worst cases to the recently set up tables. Dr. Bishop watched them begin treating the wounded before turning to the lieutenant. What happened to them? Sergeant Rook angrily answered, one of your damn raptors attacked us and would have been worse if we didn't drive it off. Spitting on the floor like some kind of exclamation point at the end of his statement. Dr. Bishop stepped back slightly at the sergeant. Rook's anger before gathering himself. You drove it off? Hi-ho! Lieutenant Kuri waved the furious scout back and said, one of my Marines tossed a grenade into its mouth and nearly blew the jaw off. That was one of the scout version raptors. And I replied, the combat raptors would have fought until they'd either killed all of you or were destroyed. The scout ones are programmed to survive and return with any intel they gathered. You got lucky. Lieutenant Kuri's gaze went to the line of body bags along one wall. Yeah? Lucky! The hint of guilt and sadness betraying his real feelings on the matter. Dr. Bishop finally seemed to look around and ask Lieutenant Kuri, are the rest of your men still topside? Sergeant, Rook chuckled. We're it? BB, but why just you? Dr. Bishop spluttered. Lieutenant Kuri spoke up. We were sent to find out why you hadn't made contact lately. They assumed it was some kind of mechanical failure or stellar storm. We just happened to be nearby on a training mission. At that moment, the voice of the dropship pilot rang out over the comm system. Lieutenant Kuri, dropship 7536 with priority message. Lieutenant Kuri keyed his chin. Mick. Go ahead, 7536. We got a large bogey on our sensors and headed our way in a hurry. The pilot replied. The lieutenant looked at Dr. Bishop and Anai with a questioning look. A glance at the doctor told him what he needed to know. Get the hell out of there and head for the ship. 7536 copy, heading back to the barn. Relief evident in the pilot's voice. All right, what the hell did he see on sensors? The lieutenant demanded. Well, you see, we were experimenting with other forms and made a Dr. Bishop started. Anai finished for him. It is a dragon, Lieutenant Sergeant. Rook practically shouted. Are you shitting me? A fucking dragon? Why in the hell did you do that? In a defensive tone, Dr. Bishop replied, it seemed like a good idea at the time. How big is this thing? The lieutenant asked Anai. A holographic image of a metallic-looking dragon appeared next to the lieutenant. Anai answered with 50.762 meters long from tail to muzzle. 65,287 kilos or 72 tons. 60 m thick alloyed armor. How does it fly? Lieutenant Kuri inquired. A combination of anti-gravity generators for lift and control thrusters located at multiple points along the body. Anai replied. I suppose it's armed? Lieutenant Kuri asked rhetorically. Anai answered, claws and talons are tough enough to shred body armor and most power armor in a couple of blows. It has a bite force of 10,000 psi. Does it shoot fire? One of the Marines asked, but Lieutenant Kuri didn't know who. Plasma thrower located in the mouth with an effective range of 20 meters. Anai replied. Anything else? The lieutenant demanded. Dr. Bishop looked at the floor as he quietly answered, some kaiju. Sergeant, Rook burst out. What the fuck is a KG or whatever it's called? Kaiju, and I corrected before continuing. They are giant monsters from movies and anime popular on Earth 300 years ago. This just keeps getting better and better, Sergeant. Rook muttered. Shaking his head, Lieutenant Kuri asked, What do you mean by giant? How big are we talking about? 90 to 100 meters tall, but bigger ones were being designed, Dr. Bishop answered. Just how many total bots are no longer under control? At least several hundred, from smaller than a person to the giant kaiju, Dr. Bishop replied. Several hundred? Sergeant. Rook thundered. Fuck, the lieutenant muttered before speaking up. Any chance of regaining control from here? We've been trying, but we think a solar flare caused any of the bots that weren't in a hardened facility to go haywire, Dr. Bishop answered. Nodding to the security androids, is that why these didn't go berserk? Yes, almost all were in this compound, and the ones that weren't followed their programming and shut down. And I answered, So why didn't the others do that? Lieutenant Kuri queried. The security androids have a kill switch because they work so closely with humans and AIs. It was thought that it wasn't needed for bots like those. And I replied. Lieutenant Kuri looked over at Sergeant Rook, who replied to the unspoken question. We don't have near enough firepower to take a raptor down, let alone a goddamn dragon or one of those Kajun things. Kaiju, Dr. Bishop corrected. Yeah, whatever, the sergeant said dismissively. I was thinking the same thing, the lieutenant commented. So we're gonna call the ship and have them contact Fleet Command to send reinforcements with heavier weapons. Why not just evacuate and nuke it from orbit? Sergeant, Rook asked. 1, as long as that dragon is around. We can't evac, Lieutenant said, holding up one finger before adding a second and finishing. We may have more civilians trapped in other buildings, but I'm not sending out squads without sufficient firepower. Aye, sir, Sergeant, Rook replied, satisfied to have an actual plan. So what's the plan? Make sure all entrances are welded shut, leaving 2 on opposite ends as a bolt hole. Sealed tight, but not welded shut. Barricades at these 3 junctions with a fire team manning each one, the lieutenant ordered before continuing. Another, stronger barricade here and here to block off this blast door, which will be our fallback position. Wouldn't it be better to just keep everyone inside here? The doctor asked. Both Lieutenant Kuri and Sergeant Rook shook their heads in the negative. We'd be trapped with nowhere to go and prefer to save that as a last resort. Lieutenant Kuri answered. And I'd like to thin the bastards out some and get some payback for my dead men, the scout added. Lieutenant Kuri keyed his chin. Mick Triton, Kuri, he said out loud. Triton, go ahead, Lieutenant, a comms officer replied. The lieutenant gave them a brief report on the situation and then added, We need reinforcements and heavier firepower to evacuate the civilians. Oh, and going to need a bigger boat, the lieutenant said. Our dropships aren't big enough to get us all in one trip. Understood, Lieutenant. We'll see what we can do. Just sit tight, the voice ordered. Understood. Thank you, the lieutenant finished before closing the channel. Sit tight? Where the hell else am I going to go? He asked rhetorically. Walking into the hallway, he looked around and spotted who he was looking for. At the scout's questioning look, he replied, They'll see what they can do and to just sit tight. Sergeant. Rook laughed dismissively. Not like I planned on taking a walk in the forest. Lieutenant Kuri chuckled before asking, How are the defenses coming? Sergeant. Rook replied, I got 4 teams sealing doors and hatches, 2 men with visuals on the 2 doors we are leaving for access/egress, with the rest started on the barricades. Those are going slowly with how few bodies are left to work. Lieutenant nodded. Sounds good. Let's get some of the civilians to help. The sergeant gave an evil grin. I like it. Get some use out of them and make them get their hands dirty. The lieutenant grinned and said, I know of a pair of strong backs that can help out too, he said as he pulled on his gloves. Don't we need someone to stand back and supervise the work? Sergeant, Rook replied, the grease on his hands showing he was kidding. You know how it is, Sergeant Elk Cowrie replied. Embrace the suck. Why don't you break the good news to our civilians? The lieutenant ordered. Sergeant. Rook got that evil grin again and walked into the control room. His voice thundered in a way that all senior non-coms seemed to have. Lieutenant Curry laughed and set to work on the closest barricade.